March 2025 dawned cold and unyielding, the kind of day where the air felt heavy with an impending storm. But for Kilmar Abrego Garcia, it wasn't the weather that felt oppressive, it was the knock on his door. The knock that shattered his life. Kilmar had come to America in 2011, fleeing the brutal violence of the MS-13 gang in El Salvador. He had left behind the wreckage of his homeland, a country torn apart by gang warfare and poverty, and sought refuge in the United States, a place that had promised him safety. For years, he had rebuilt his life in Maryland. He found a job, started a family, and settled into the peace he had always dreamed of. But that peace was fragile. In 2015, Kilmar had been granted Temporary Protected Status, TPS, a program that shielded him from deportation due to the violent unrest in El Salvador. Under the status, he had every right to stay in the United States. He wasn't just a number in the system, he was a father, a husband, and a productive member of society. But none of that mattered the day IC agents came to his door. Without warning, the agents stormed into his home, taking Kilmar into custody, leaving his wife and children in shock. There had been no warning. No notice. Just an abrupt, invasive decision that would change the course of his life. The reason for his detention? Allegations that Kilmar was involved with the very gang that had forced him to flee in the first place, MS-13. The charges were based on incomplete and inaccurate information. An intelligence report that labeled him a gang member despite the fact that there was no evidence to support the claim. The mistake wasn't his, but it would become his burden to carry. Kilmar's deportation would follow swiftly, a cruel irony that had become all too common for many innocent immigrants. He was forcibly taken from the United States and sent back to El Salvador, a country he hadn't known for years, a country where the violence and instability that had driven him away still held sway. The U.S. government had made a catastrophic error. Kilmar wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a gang member. He was a father who had only sought refuge. Yet he found himself locked in a foreign prison awaiting a fate that seemed inescapable. In El Salvador, he was placed in the notorious terrorism confinement center, Socote, a place where the worst criminals were housed. A place where survival wasn't guaranteed. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. Kilmar's family, still in the United States, fought back against the injustice of it all. Legal experts were consulted. Lawyers began preparing their case. But as the weeks passed, it became apparent that this was no ordinary case, it was a political hot potato, one that had begun to shake the foundations of American immigration policy. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Kilmar's deportation was a violation of U.S. law. He had been granted protection under TPS, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that his deportation was illegal. The court had spoken. The ruling was clear. Kilmar was to be returned to the United States. Yet, as the days stretched into weeks, Kilmar remained in a foreign prison and the government's indifference to his plight grew more evident. Attorney General Pam Bondi, a key player in the Trump administration, took center stage, doubling down on the administration's stance. She refused to acknowledge the Supreme Court's decision, claiming that the U.S. had no obligation to bring Kilmar back unless El Salvador agreed to release him. Bondi's words stung. They were a sharp contrast to the promises of justice and fairness that America had once prided itself on. But for her, this was a matter of national security, a defense of what she believed was the right course of action, no matter the cost. To her, the court's ruling was secondary. National interest, her version of national interest, came first. As the media began to cover the case, it became clear that Kilmar's story was not just an isolated incident, it was a symbol of a broken system. A system that had failed him, a system that was now being defended by a government that was more concerned with its own agenda than with upholding the rule of law. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was no longer just a name on a legal document. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with a system that claimed to uphold justice but often turned a blind eye to those who most needed it. As the legal wrangling intensified, Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case became a political flashpoint. In the eyes of many, this was more than just a deportation case, it was a test of America's commitment to its own principles of justice. The U.S. Supreme Court had spoken, Kilmar's deportation was illegal. Yet, the administration refused to comply, and that refusal would shake the very foundation of American law. The moment the ruling came down from the Supreme Court, it seemed like a victory. Kilmar was to be returned to the U.S. His long-awaited chance at freedom was within reach. But what happened next felt like a slap in the face of justice. Instead of an immediate return to his family and the life he had worked so hard to build, the wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly and Kilmar remained trapped in El Salvador. The administration, led by Attorney General Pam Bondi, dug in its heels. Bondi's refusal to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling was clear. In an interview that sent shockwaves through the legal community, she publicly declared, "We don't want him back." The words echoed across the nation. The Attorney General, the very person sworn to uphold the law, had openly defied the highest court in the land. To many, this felt like a betrayal of everything America stood for, a rejection of the very principles of justice that had made the nation a beacon of hope to the world. Bondi's stance was rooted in what she described as a commitment to national security. She argued that Kilmar's deportation was necessary not just for the safety of the United States, but for the integrity of its immigration policies. To her, the risk of allowing someone she believed to be linked to gang activity to return was too great. It didn't matter that the Supreme Court had ruled otherwise. Bondi made it clear that, in her view, the court's decision was not the final word. "The law is what we make it," she said in a press briefing, her words chilling to those who believed that the rule of law should be impartial and above the political fray. "We will not be bullied into ignoring national security for the sake of one man." But Kilmar's supporters were not so easily swayed. Legal experts and civil rights organizations rallied behind him, demanding that the administration comply with the Supreme Court's ruling. It wasn't just a matter of Kilmar's fate, it was a matter of whether the government could continue to flout the law without consequence. Advocates argued that Kilmar's case was not unique. There were countless other individuals like him, immigrants who had fled violence and built new lives in the U.S. only to find themselves caught in the crossfire of an increasingly hostile immigration policy. If the government could defy the highest court in the land in one case, what would stop them from doing it again? As the weeks passed and Kilmar remained stuck in El Salvador, the tension only mounted. His family in the U.S. fought tirelessly to bring him back, but they were up against a political machine that seemed determined to ignore the rule of law. Meanwhile, public opinion began to shift. More and more Americans were beginning to see the injustice of Kilmar's situation. His story was no longer just about one man, it had become a symbol of the broken immigration system and a reminder that the powerful could, at times, escape accountability. The legal and political battle reached its peak when a group of legal scholars issued a joint statement condemning the administration's refusal to comply with the Supreme Court ruling. They argued that the refusal to bring Kilmar back was not just a legal error, it was a direct challenge to the very notion of judicial authority in the United States. This case, the scholars wrote, is about more than one man's deportation. It is about whether the law can be ignored when it is inconvenient to those in power. But despite the mounting pressure from all sides, Attorney General Pam Bondi stood firm. "Our country's safety must come first," she said, "and the law will not stand in the way of that." Her words were a stark reminder of the lengths to which some in power were willing to go to protect their own agendas, even if it meant disregarding the law. The battle between law and power raged on, and Kilmar's fate hung in the balance. Would the administration relent? Would the law finally prevail? Or would this case become the symbol of a new chapter in American history, one where the law was bent and twisted to fit the political will of those in power? For Kilmar, there was no answer yet. He remained in limbo, caught between two worlds, one where justice was supposed to reign and another where it seemed to be little more than a distant ideal. As Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case continued to unfold, it was no longer just about one man or one family. It became a national issue. With each passing day, his story gained more attention. Media outlets across the country picked up the story, and public outrage began to swell. The question that echoed through every corner of the nation was simple. How could a government blatantly defy the Supreme Court's decision and ignore the very principles of justice upon which the country was founded? Attorney General Pam Bondi's refusal to comply with the Supreme Court ruling ignited a firestorm. The more she spoke, the more the American people seemed to turn against her. Legal experts, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike began to voice their concerns, arguing that the government's blatant disregard for the rule of law was not just an attack on one individual. It was an attack on the very fabric of American democracy. News stories across the nation were filled with headlines such as, "AG Bondi defies Supreme Court," "Kilmar's deportation battle rages on," and "America's legal crisis. Who's above the law?" The public was captivated by the idea that one individual could be caught in the crossfire of a political agenda that had no respect for the law. Civil rights organizations sprang into action. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, along with several immigration advocacy groups, filed amicus briefs in Kilmar's case, demanding that the government comply with the Supreme Court's ruling. The legal teams working on Kilmar's behalf pulled no punches, arguing that the longer he remained in El Salvador, the greater the danger to his life. Kilmar's family, too, became outspoken advocates for his return, holding rallies and speaking out in public forums. The legal battle escalated to new heights when a coalition of former Supreme Court justices and legal scholars published an open letter condemning the government's actions. They stated, "This is not a case of one man's deportation. This is a fundamental issue of justice and the rule of law in our nation. If we allow the executive branch to ignore the will of the highest court, we are laying the groundwork for a dangerous precedent." Public opinion was divided, but as more Americans learned the details of Kilmar's story, the tide began to shift in his favor. Social media platforms, once again, became a battleground for justice. Hashtags such as #BringKilmarHome and #JusticeForKilmar flooded Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, with ordinary Americans, celebrities, and influencers all joining in solidarity. Among the voices of support, some of the most influential came from the world of politics. Progressive lawmakers, including Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, called for swift action to bring Kilmar back to the United States. Both lawmakers issued statements condemning the government's handling of the case and called for Pam Bondi to be held accountable for her defiance of the Supreme Court. On the other side of the political spectrum, more conservative figures such as Senators Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley defended the government's stance, claiming that national security should trump the rulings of the Supreme Court. But this position was increasingly being questioned by their own constituents, many of whom were former immigrants themselves or who had witnessed firsthand the struggles of families who were being unjustly affected by the harsh immigration policies. The country was divided, but there was a growing realization that this case wasn't just about Kilmar. It was a test of America's character, a challenge to its fundamental values of justice, fairness, and the rule of law. For every person who sided with Bondi's stance on national security, there were countless others who believed that the heart of America was at stake. As the weeks turned into months, the situation grew more dire. Kilmar remained stuck in a foreign prison, his life hanging in the balance. But the growing outcry from all sides could not be ignored. It seemed as though every legal expert, activist, and politician was demanding the same thing: justice. Yet, as much as the outcry grew louder, Attorney General Pam Bondi's response remained unchanged. She doubled down, insisting that her position was the correct one, regardless of the court's decision. She framed Kilmar's return as a national security risk and refused to back down even as the pressure mounted. To many, it felt like a battle between two Americas. On one side, there were those who saw Kilmar as a victim of a broken immigration system, a man caught up in the harsh realities of a government that had failed to protect him. On the other, there were those who saw him as a symbol of the dangers posed by unchecked immigration and the need to defend the integrity of the nation's borders. But the question remained, what price was America willing to pay for its ideals? Was the country willing to break the law in the name of national security? Was the rule of law only valuable when it suited the political needs of those in power? The debate was fierce, but for Kilmar Abrego Garcia, there was only one truth: he had done nothing wrong. He had only sought refuge from the horrors of gang violence in El Salvador. And yet, in the land of opportunity, he found himself entangled in a web of legal battles and political agendas that were determined to strip him of the future he had built. As Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case continued to dominate the headlines, the spotlight shifted from the intricacies of legal arguments to the emotional and moral heart of the story. It was no longer just about legal precedents, national security, or the political posturing of those in power. It became a defining moment for the American people, an opportunity to reflect on the values they held dear and the ideals that had defined the nation for centuries. From the outset, Kilmar's story was one of survival. He had fled El Salvador's brutal gang violence, seeking sanctuary in the United States, a place that had long been considered a refuge for the oppressed and the displaced. Yet, despite his desire to live peacefully, his life was now entwined in a bitter battle that seemed to have little to do with the man he was or the life he had built. Instead, it was a reflection of the larger political and legal struggles that were tearing at the fabric of American democracy. Kilmar's supporters, many of whom had never met him, rallied around him because they saw in his case the deep injustices embedded in the current immigration system. They saw the face of a man caught between two conflicting worlds, the world of justice, which demanded his return, and the world of political agendas where the human cost was secondary to national security concerns. Rallies, protests, and public gatherings were organized across the country from New York to California, all calling for Kilmar's return. These gatherings were not just about one man, they were about the future of America itself. The message was clear: no government, no matter how powerful, should be allowed to ignore the rule of law. One particularly powerful moment occurred in Washington, D.C. when a group of legal scholars, immigration advocates, and concerned citizens gathered for a march on the steps of the Capitol building. Holding banners that read "Justice for Kilmar" and "The law must prevail," they made their voices heard in the heart of the nation's political center. They demanded accountability from Pam Bondi and the Trump administration, calling on them to honor the Supreme Court's ruling and bring Kilmar back to his family. As the rally swelled, one prominent speaker, a former federal judge, addressed the crowd with a passionate plea: "We are witnessing a crisis of accountability. If we allow the government to ignore a Supreme Court ruling today, what does that say about our commitment to justice tomorrow? Our courts are not just there for show, they are the bedrock of our democracy. And we cannot allow any government official to trample on them." The crowd erupted into applause, and for a brief moment it seemed like the will of the people might actually shift the tide. But as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that Pam Bondi was not backing down. Despite the growing chorus of voices calling for her to respect the rule of law, she continued to dig in her heels. She remained unwavering in her assertion that Kilmar's deportation was necessary for the safety of the country. In a statement released by her office, Bondi once again reiterated her stance: national security is the highest priority. Kilmar Abrego Garcia poses a threat to that security, and that is why we cannot allow him to return to the United States. The Supreme Court's ruling may have been issued, but we will not be swayed by political pressure or public outcry. We will make the decisions that are in the best interest of the American people. But as the political battle raged on, more and more Americans began to question the Attorney General's logic. Was the need for national security so urgent that it justified violating the fundamental rights of an individual? Could the government truly be trusted to make such a decision without considering the human cost? These were the questions that dominated public discourse. Kilmar's family, meanwhile, continued to fight tirelessly for his return. They held press conferences, met with lawmakers, and worked with legal experts to explore every possible avenue for getting him back to the United States. His wife, a U.S. citizen, and their children, all American-born, were among the loudest voices calling for justice. "Our family has been torn apart," she said in an emotional interview. "My husband is not a criminal. He is not a threat to anyone. He is a father, a husband, and a man who has worked hard to build a life here. He deserves the chance to return to his family, and we deserve to be together again." The emotional weight of Kilmar's family's struggle was felt by many across the country. It was hard to ignore the pain and frustration in the voices of his loved ones. They were not just fighting for one man, they were fighting for the principle that no one should be torn from their family simply because of political agendas or national security concerns that seemed to have little basis in reality. The situation was becoming more complex by the day, with no easy resolution in sight. The political climate was growing more heated, and Kilmar's case was no longer just an isolated incident. It had become a flashpoint for larger debates over immigration, justice, and the role of the courts in holding the government accountable. Despite the mounting pressure, Pam Bondi remained defiant. Her insistence that Kilmar's return would compromise national security continued to serve as the cornerstone of her position. But as the story of Kilmar's plight spread, more and more Americans began to see through the rhetoric. His case had transcended politics. It had become a question of right versus wrong, law versus power. For many, the ultimate question was simple: could America stand on the side of justice, or would it succumb to the forces of political expediency and disregard for the rule of law? As the battle over Kilmar Abrego Garcia's fate reached its crescendo, the country stood at a crossroads. The fight had transcended from a legal dispute into a national moral dilemma. Would America uphold its cherished principles of justice, fairness, and the rule of law? Or would it bow to the pressures of national security rhetoric, trampling on individual rights and disregarding the very Constitution that had made the United States a beacon of hope for the oppressed? In the final stages of the case, tensions were at an all-time high. The rallies had grown larger, the protests louder, and the media coverage more intense. Pam Bondi, ever the steadfast defender of her stance, was under unprecedented pressure, not just from the public, but from fellow politicians, former allies, and legal scholars. Yet, she refused to back down. She clung to the argument that Kilmar was a threat to national security, refusing to acknowledge the growing doubts surrounding her position. As public outcry continued, there were whispers in political circles that Pam Bondi's political career might be on the line. Some of her staunchest supporters in Congress began to quietly distance themselves from her, fearing the backlash could hurt them in upcoming elections. Even members of the Trump administration began to question whether the damage to the nation's reputation was worth the political gamesmanship. The divisions within the political elite were becoming more pronounced, and the cracks in Bondi's defense were widening. But despite all this, Bondi remained unmoved. She doubled down on her position, firmly believing that her stance was what was best for the country. The law may say one thing, but we must always act in the interest of national security, she repeated in numerous interviews. Her rhetoric was aimed at reassuring her base, who had supported the aggressive immigration policies that had defined much of the Trump administration. Meanwhile, Kilmar's family, along with the growing coalition of legal advocates and immigration reform activists, was not about to let the issue die. The pressure from all sides continued to mount. Kilmar's children, now used to living without their father, began to speak out more publicly. "Why does he have to suffer?" his daughter asked in an emotional interview. "He's a good person. He loves this country and he just wants to be with us. Why can't they let him come back?" The emotional pleas from his family were difficult to ignore. Kilmar had never been a criminal, nor had he shown any intention of doing harm to the United States. His only crime was seeking refuge from the violence of his homeland and trying to create a better life for his family. To many, this made his continued detention and the fight for his deportation seem all the more unjust. His family's fight was now America's fight. The case reached its final moment when, in an unexpected twist, a bipartisan group of lawmakers, including both Democrats and Republicans, decided to introduce new legislation aimed at ensuring that the government could not ignore Supreme Court rulings in the future. They called it the Justice for Immigrants Act, and it was a direct challenge to the actions of Attorney General Pam Bondi and the Trump administration. The bill proposed measures to ensure that deportation decisions could not be carried out without proper judicial oversight and that individuals like Kilmar would have access to legal processes that could prevent unjust deportations. The bill's introduction marked a turning point in the battle. As lawmakers began to debate the merits of the legislation, it became clear that the country was beginning to change. The issue was no longer just about Kilmar. He had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the current immigration system and the government's handling of justice. Amid the growing support for his cause, Kilmar's legal team filed one final appeal, urging the Supreme Court to intervene and force the Trump administration to comply with the lower court's ruling. For Kilmar's supporters, this was their last hope. If the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, it would not just be a victory for him, it would be a victory for justice, for fairness, and for the rule of law. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. The Supreme Court issued a ruling, and as the nation held its breath, the court declared that Kilmar Abrego Garcia's deportation was unjust and violated his rights under both American law and international human rights standards. The decision was a resounding affirmation of the principles that had been under siege for so long. Kilmar was ordered to be brought back to the United States, and the government was instructed to provide him with the legal protections he had been denied for so long. The nation erupted in applause. It was a victory for the rule of law, a victory for the American people who had rallied behind Kilmar, and a victory for justice. Pam Bondi, who had been so steadfast in her opposition, was forced to concede. The political fallout from the case was massive, and many saw her defiance as a sign of the growing disconnect between the government and the people it was supposed to serve. Kilmar's return was not just a personal triumph, it was a testament to the power of grassroots activism, the strength of the American legal system, and the enduring belief that no one is above the law. For Kilmar, it was a moment of redemption, a chance to reunite with his family and finally put the nightmare behind him. In the end, America had passed its moral test. The question of whether the country would stand for justice or whether it would succumb to political manipulation had been answered. And while the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia had ended, the broader fight for justice and fairness continued, with millions of Americans more determined than ever to ensure that the country remained true to its ideals.